afternoon. My name is Dan Silber. I'm with Elexco Land Services. I'm from outside of Rochester, New York, so I might be the only American in the crowd. No, we got another one, it looks like, so there's two of us. If I slip into some nomenclature that I use in New York, like recording instead of registry, or if I call it the Onondaga instead of whatever balls falls you use out here, don't throw anything at me. I'm trying really hard. Hopefully what I'm going to do is talk about some of the stuff that I encounter. It's more contractual in nature, and maybe get you thinking about things that you encounter on a day-to-day basis. And as more and more energy projects and more energy sources are developed, maybe get you thinking about the future of how they might interact. So the types, I've labeled them into three different categories: above ground, at ground, below ground. Just got three professionals there in a small space trying to get all their work done. Rudimentary, very crude display of what we might encounter, just to get you thinking about the types of projects. Like overhead, you see there you've got some wind turbines. You'll also have overhead transmission lines. You've got surface level, which is more conventional oil and gas. You've got solar, which is a bigger and bigger piece as we go forward. But then you have existing uses. You've got farmland, you've got forests. All those things are competing at the surface level. And what I call the shallow surface, you've got a whole network of either transmission pipelines, transporting gas or other chemicals or liquids, also transmitting electricity through a whole network of pipelines. And then below that, you've got all those nice formations that previous speakers have talked about in depth. Presentation is fairly simple. We're going to talk about project types. Where do these physical conflicts arise? Where do the contractual conflicts arise? What are the issues? And then what are some of the remedies and how do you resolve some of those? We already talked about some of the project types: the above ground, the at surface, and then the very deep surface. But one I didn't think about to put on my list was nuclear deposit. Like where that's a new one for me. Where does that fit into the mix? Well, it fits into with all the other subsurface ones, but it was just another. It's another example of how energy and the energy field is always expanding, changing, morphing, and moving along. So where do the physical conflicts arise? Basically, when one project's physical facilities are going to be in the same physical location as another project's facilities. This can be either horizontal, could be vertical. The horizontal is a good example of that is like a pipeline, a transmission pipeline. Can extend for hundreds of kilometers. Or it could be vertical. You could have a development of a very deep shale or reef or other formation, and that comes after the development of a very shallow formation. So you could be drilling through somebody else's project, or you could be horizontally going across another company's project. And then if you want to really expand that out, it's not just energy projects that conflict. You're dealing with existing infrastructure. Other folks are using the lands too for other resources. You can expand this to drainage tile for farms. You can think about roads, streams, a lot of areas where you're going to run into other people's stuff. Where do contractual conflicts arise? Well, one of them is actual knowledge. So if you're planning a project and you go out onto that ground where you want to develop, say, your solar field, and you see an oil and gas well there. Well, right there you have actual knowledge that somebody else has some rights to that property. So even though you might be in the pre-planning stage, the very advanced stage and you haven't even tried to acquire any rights, you're just thinking about that would be a good spot for a solar field. You already know, okay, well, if I go there, I'm going to have to deal with, in some fashion, those existing rights. That's actual knowledge. You might have record knowledge of another project. That's why folks register their documents. They register their memo of lease, their option, their easement, their oil and gas rights if they've been severed from the surface. If you're really usually more into the advanced planning stage or actually the implementation stage, you're going to be looking at those rights, or you should be, I would think, because you want to know who else out there has rights that might impact your rights, and might be, and usually if they're there first, they're going to be superior to your rights. Not always, not always. It really depends on the situation. So that's one thing where the contractual conflicts arise. Who has those rights, and what do those rights entail? Because some of the issues that arise, aside from the two parties that may or may not want to deal with each other, you're going to have old documents. You're going to have documents with very vague language. You might have an oil and gas lease from 100 years ago. We talked about that well that was over 100 years old. Well, what did that lease look like? What rights did that company obtain when that well was first drilled? It might be a half a page. It might be a half a page, and most of that half a page is going to be taken up with naming the parties, where they're located, naming the property, and then the signature line, and then the notary line after that. There's not a lot of room in the middle of all that to discuss exactly what rights that company has to that particular piece of project under that particular lease. So vague language is really a difficult one, because in this industry, you want to have some sort of confidence that you're going out and you can do what you want to do, even if there's another prior agreement in place on the property you want to use. When you have that vague language, old language usually, you don't have that level of confidence. There's a lot of questions. What did they intend? What kind of, how far do those rights extend? What did they prevent somebody else from doing? Again, that document might not contain the answers to all those questions. And along the same lines, you might have modern documents that are very good at spelling out your rights, but you might not have a document that spells out your specific situation. So even though you might have a 20-page easement that's recorded, a lot of that might be language to make the lender comfortable. There might be talk about what if this document is assigned, what if a mortgage is put on, what if a foreclosure happens. It might not have detailed language about what if somebody else wants to use the same property. There's blanket easements out there. I give you a 50-foot right-of-way over my 200-acre farm. Right? Well, where is that exactly? A lot of those early easements were blanket across the entire property. And once you put in that your whatever facility you're building, and say in this case a pipeline, well, are you excluded from using the rest of the property? It's not always clear with the way that those documents are written. Sometimes there's allowance for one pipeline, but sometimes there's allowance for more than one pipeline, 1, 2, 3 pipelines. And what if you build one? Well, are you limited to that location of original construction, or do you have rights to use any and all parts of the original 300 acres? And of course, that original 300 acres is probably not one 300-acre farm today. It's probably 6 50-acre parcels. So do you have rights to go over all of those different parcels? Option term versus lease term, that's become kind of more prevalent, I guess, lately, where somebody had mentioned it takes 7 years to get a project constructed from inception to actual building. Well, that's about how long it takes for a lot of these different projects. You're talking a 100 megawatt solar farm, you're talking a wind farm with multiple turbines, you're talking about these energy storage projects. They all take a long time. So you have a lot of times now you have an option term and then you have a lease term. Well, there's not always a good recording that follows up on the original recording or registry. See, I did it. The original registry to explain where you are in the process. Are you still in the option term? Have you actually exercised that option and now you're in the development term or in the production term? But that's the same thing that I guess we've dealt with for a long time with oil and gas leases. You usually have this primary term where you have a certain amount of time in order to figure out whether you're going to be able to drill on that parcel or not. And then after you've drilled, you've got the secondary term that goes on a lot of times for as long as production as long as the well is capable of production. Well, how long is that? When did that start? Did it start? Did the original primary term, did they do what they needed to do to keep the lease valid and existing for the secondary term. A lot of times you're not going to be able to tell about that by looking at the documents. You're going to have to know some facts about when was that well drilled. Or not only when it was drilled, was there enough activity that happened on the property in anticipating or starting the well in order to kick it into that secondary term. All right, last slide here. We talk about how do we resolve these issues. There's a lot of ways, and it really depends a lot on the projects and on the parties too. Some parties approach this as a moneymaker. I've got rights. I don't intend to use them. I don't intend to do anything more on that property. I'm going to keep this well going with as little input as I can for as long as I can, but they see this as, hey, somebody else wants something. This is where I'm going to make some money off of them. The railroads, at least in the States, they've done this for a long time. They don't move a lot of freight as they once did, but they have these incredible rights that are linear and extend hundreds of miles. So they realize that they have quite an asset there for other projects. So cable, pipelines, electric lines, gathering lines, transmission lines, everybody, or a lot of different energy projects use those existing rail corridors in order to make their life easier because you're only dealing with one person, or one entity, I should say. But when you're only dealing with that one entity and they're calling the shots and they're big and nationwide, then they can command quite a high price. Other companies see it as long as they recoup their costs, they're happy. They realize that they have to play in the sandbox with these other companies. They don't want to make money off of it. They just want to not go in the hole for having to deal with the paperwork, because they're going to have to figure out what the property is, what the rights are, get it to their legal team, get a document drafted, get it approved by whoever is approving the land contracts for that area. They're going to have to put a lot of time and money into it before the agreement is signed and then recorded or registered. So some folks just want to recoup that and don't want to go out of pocket to do that. But other companies I've worked with see it as very reciprocal. They're out there constructing a lot of projects. They're laying a lot of different lines, doing impacting a lot of other facilities, crossing a lot of other facilities. So some of them see it as reciprocal. Okay, well, I know that I'm going to need a favor from you at one point, so I'm going to go ahead and grant you this request. Those are kind of the three major categories of companies and how they approach it. Other ways to resolve, you can go to the courts. Not always the first choice for any company that I've worked with. Courts, as we all know, can be long, they're expensive, they're also unpredictable. You don't know what a judge is going to rule at the end of the day. You might have very clear rights, or what you think are very clear rights in your agreement, and very clear rights vis-a-vis the other company's agreement. But I've been involved in enough court actions to know that you could have a wild card judge that just doesn't care about the contractual niceties of the parties. They want to reach a decision, and they're going to figure out a way to reach that decision. I know that that's probably not a very popular opinion, but I think it's a reality opinion. I think that a lot of folks work really hard to secure their rights and try to make them bulletproof, but only to have them undone by a judge that doesn't do contractual law very often and sometimes, isn't even very aware of all the facts. Another way to approach it, hope for the best. I'm going to go out there, I'm going to ignore all the actual knowledge, I'm going to ignore all the record knowledge. I'm just going to go out there and develop my project. And if somebody comes and challenges me, well, I'll deal with it when that time comes. Again, I don't think that's the majority approach, because it's really pretty risky, especially if you're drilling one well or building one turbine or developing a 5 megawatt solar farm. That's one thing. You don't have a tremendous amount of capital investment here. But if you're building some of these bigger projects, and they seem to be getting bigger and bigger and bigger, these, there's too much at risk here. And your lenders too, they're not going to sit back and just let you take those risks. They're going to force you to deal with them. So that comes down to the agreement. Hopefully, you can address each party's concerns in agreement, in a written agreement. Sometimes it's a battle of forms. Sometimes there's detailed schematics that you're going to need of who's going to cross where and how deep, and then are you going to put flagging on there? Are you going to have a representative of the company out there at the time of digging? All sorts of very, very particular details might go into that agreement. It's going to be payment terms, one-time payment, annual payment, and then it's also going to deal with future reconstruction. Okay, what happens if I've got to move my line, add a line, or change a line out? That's what I like to deal with most, because it's probably the most definite way to understand what your rates are against competing rates on the same property. And I think I just made it under my 15 minutes, so I'm going to close it out there. Thank you.